Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, checking your phone, and finding that the geopolitical chessboard of the entire world has just been completely flipped overnight. All the pieces you thought were, locked in place, just swept completely off the board.
Right.
We are looking at an unprecedented event unfolding in the skies over the Middle East right now. It is, without exaggeration, one of the largest air campaigns in human history. And that is exactly what we are unpacking for you today.
Yeah, and to help you really understand the sheer scale and, more importantly, the hidden mechanics of what is happening up there, we're doing a deep dive into some highly urgent source material. We have a transcript featuring two very different but fascinating experts.
Okay, set the stage for us. Who are we listening to?
So, on one side, you have investigative journalist Richard Miniter. He's based in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
deeply plugged into the intelligence and defense communities there. On the other side, reporting live from Dubai, is Ayman Dean.
His background is wild.
Oh, absolutely. He's a former al-Qaeda member who turned and became an MI6 double agent. So he understands the internal wiring of these Middle Eastern proxy networks from the inside out. Our mission today is to synthesize their knowledge so we can understand this massive multinational strike on Iran, the sudden collapse of its leadership, and frankly, the global shockwaves that are triggering reactions from Washington all the way to Beijing.
But before we get into the tactical details and the secret backroom plans they lay out, we really have to address the nature of the information we're dealing with here, because we are looking at a highly polarized map of the world.
Yeah, that's crucial. Before we dive in, we need to make something very clear to you. Our sources today contain highly polarized, politically charged commentary.
It gets intense.
It does. It includes harsh criticisms of previous U.S. administrations, praise for current U.S. strategies, and stark descriptions of the Iranian regime. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of these left-wing or right-wing viewpoints. Our goal is strictly to impartially report the facts and perspectives contained in this source material so you can understand the arguments these experts are making.
All right, disclaimer out of the way. Let's unpack the sheer, overwhelming scale of the attack itself, because we are looking at a massive 2,000 sortie air campaign.
Yeah.
Just picture that. 2,000 individual aircraft missions screaming into hostile airspace in a 48-hour window.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
Right. And it's a tag team operation between the United States and Israel, working through an immense, highly coordinated target list. The logistics of pulling this off are staggering, especially when you look at how they are, dividing the labor up there.
And Miniter's breakdown of the tactical limitations really illuminates why this has to be a joint operation. See, Israel's fighter jets, like the F-35s, they're incredibly advanced for evading radar, taking out surface-to-air missile batteries.
The suppression stuff.
Exactly. However, they generally cannot carry or drop bunker-busting bombs larger than 5,000 pounds. And Iran has spent decades burying its most sensitive military and nuclear assets deep inside hollowed-out mountains, specifically in the Zagros mountain range.
Right.
A 5,000-pound bomb simply isn't going to penetrate hundreds of feet of solid rock and reinforced concrete.
And that is exactly where the United States comes in for the heavy lifting. The U.S. possesses the massive ordnance penetrators, the 30,000-pound bunker busters.
That you're terrified.
They are. We are talking about a weapon that is essentially a flying telephone pole made of hardened steel, designed to burrow through 200 feet of earth before the delayed fuse even detonates. So, Israel handles the suppression of enemy air defenses, clearing the radar installations and the exposed military bases, and that paves a safe corridor for the U.S. stealth bombers to fly in and crack open the subterranean fortresses.
But alongside this massive tag team approach, what's interesting is the targeting selectivity. It's highly deliberate. They are aggressively avoiding civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, that stood out.
They're leaving the water supply alone. They're leaving the broader civilian power grids intact. The only exception to this rule, according to the sources, is if a specific power facility is directly enabling the launch of long-range missiles or drones.
So if a regional grid is powering a ballistic missile silo,
It gets neutralized. But otherwise, the strategy is explicitly designed to dismantle the regime's military capability without intentionally plunging 90 million civilians into the dark ages.
which makes sense. But despite all this precision, a massive, chaotic variable has been thrown into the mix. And this brings us to the death of Ayatollah Khamenei and the final chilling move he made before he was killed. We are talking about a literal dead man's switch.
Yeah, the sheer foresight of the Iranian leadership here is terrifying. The Ayatollah knew this day might eventually come. He knew the moment a massive coordinated strike began, the centralized command and control structure in Tehran would be decapitated instantly.
Right, communication lines severed, military headquarters vaporized.
Exactly. So anticipating this, he issued standing orders to individual decentralized military units across the country long before the first bomb ever fell.
He essentially put the entire Iranian war machine on autopilot, dispersing authority all the way down the chain of command, so the local commanders know they are in a use it or lose it scenario. If they don't fire their rockets, their drones, and their ballistic missiles right now, those weapons will be destroyed in their silos within 24 to 48 hours.
And that creates an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable environment. With centralized command gone, rogue units are making their own targeting decisions based on whatever standing orders they were given months or years ago. Dean's intelligence highlights a highly telling incident that proves this: a rogue attack on Oman.
Which is crazy. Oman is the absolute last country you would intentionally attack if you were trying to manage a regional crisis. Oman has historically been the Switzerland of the Gulf. They are the vital intermediary. Whenever the West needs to pass a back-channel message to Iran, they fly diplomats into Muscat.
And even the Iranian foreign minister had to go on state-run broadcast to complain about the Oman strike, essentially admitting they have no control over those units.
Wow.
He publicly stated the units are functioning on standing orders and didn't mean to attack Oman. If you connect this to the bigger picture, it proves definitively that Tehran has lost control of its own military. The monster has been unchained from its master.
Imagine you are a diplomat trying to negotiate a ceasefire in this environment.
Right.
Who do you even call? You can't call the top leadership. They're either dead or entirely disconnected from their own forces. You're trying to negotiate with an enemy running entirely on automated, decentralized rage. There is no one left to call off the rockets.
And these decentralized units have weapons hidden in caves and underground bunkers. They roll out under the open sky on mobile launchers, fire a barrage of missiles, and then automatically retract back into the mountain before a satellite can even register their location and vector a bomber to take them out.
Right.
The ability of the coalition to gather targeting information on these dispersed units is a massive challenge. There are, frankly, more targets scattered across the country than there are planes in the sky to neutralize them simultaneously.
So, looking at how the situation escalated to a point where a multinational armada felt compelled to unleash thousands of bombs, the sources trace this back to a fundamental strategic calculation made by the Iranian regime decades ago. It's the nuclear math. Why was Iran so absolutely desperate to build a nuclear weapon in the first place, knowing it would invite this kind of existential risk?
Well, miniatures suggest we have to look at history through the eyes of the Iranian leadership. They studied the fates of nations that flirted with nuclear weapons and then backed down.
Right.
They looked at South Africa, which built nuclear weapons but dismantled them in the early 90s, and the ruling government subsequently lost power. They looked at Ukraine, which surrendered the massive nuclear arsenal it inherited from the Soviet Union in 1994 in exchange for security guarantees from the West and Russia.
And we all know exactly how those security guarantees worked out for Ukraine. But the most poignant example for Tehran was definitely Libya, right?
Absolutely. Muammar Gaddafi voluntarily agreed to give up his nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons programs to re-enter the international community.
And Gaddafi ended up dying a brutal death on the side of a road while his country descended into a catastrophic civil war, aided by NATO air support.
Right. The Iranians looked at Libya and concluded that giving up their nuclear ambitions was a literal death sentence for the regime.
Yeah.
Then they looked at North Korea.
Oh, of course. North Korea pursued nuclear weapons, endured crippling sanctions, endured absolute international isolation, and ultimately crossed the finish line. They detonated their devices, and they gained total immunity.
Exactly. Total immunity.
The Kim dynasty secured its survival because no one is invading a nuclear-armed North Korea. So from 2005 onward, the Iranian regime accelerated its nuclear program, attempting to replicate the North Korean model of regime survival.
But Ayman Dean highlights a massive flaw in comparing Iran to North Korea. North Korea is an isolated hermit kingdom. Kim Jong-un doesn't have heavily armed proxy militias trying to take over the Philippines or launching rockets into Japan.
Right.
His strategic goal is simply to sit in his palace and be left alone by the outside world. Iran's grand strategy is entirely different.
This is the expansionist difference. The sources describe Iran's strategy as building a cancerous proxy network across the entire region. They didn't just want a nuclear shield to protect their own borders. They wanted a nuclear shield so they could aggressively export their revolution and ideology without fear of conventional retaliation.
Yeah.
Over decades, they spent billions of dollars building up a vast transnational army.
And Dean, with his background in these very networks, estimates that at its peak, this Iranian proxy network consisted of up to 700,000 armed fighters operating outside the control of normal nation-states.
700,000 fighters. Just to
Yeah.
put that in perspective, that is larger than the active duty militaries of most European nations combined. We are talking about a decentralized army spanning multiple sovereign borders.
And this network structurally varies wildly depending on the region.
Yeah.
You have Hamas in Gaza, which operates as a localized insurgency. You have the Houthis down in Yemen, who control vast swaths of territory and choke points on the Red Sea. Then you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, which functions essentially as a parallel state, possessing precision-guided munitions, a standing army, and deep political control over the Lebanese government. Then there are various powerful militias in Iraq and Syria that function as an extension of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Which is exactly why the world could not view Iran's nuclear program the same way it views North Korea's. If Iran secured a nuclear weapon, it would essentially provide a nuclear umbrella for these 700,000 proxy fighters.
Right.
It would make it nearly impossible to counter their expansionist ambitions, because any attempt to dismantle Hezbollah or the Houthis would carry the implicit threat of a nuclear response from Tehran.
And the catalyst that finally broke the camel's back, according to both Miniter and Dean, was October 7th. They are incredibly clear that October 7th was the moment that made this massive fiery confrontation inevitable.
The strategic analysis here is fascinating, because Hamas is actually one of Iran's smallest and least resourced proxies, confined to a tiny 340-kilometer strip of land in Gaza. Yet Iran was willing to support Hamas in launching a massive, horrific attack.
Yeah.
An attack they mathematically had to know would bring absolute devastation down upon the entirety of the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian population living there.
So the logic is, if the regime in Tehran was willing to sacrifice an entire population over a proxy attack from their smallest ally, what would they be willing to do with Hezbollah? What would they be willing to do with the heavily armed militias in Syria or Iraq?
And that was the terrifying realization for the West and the Arab states. They realized they could no longer tolerate a state sponsor of terror perfectly willing to use non-state actors to wreak havoc across the region while shielding itself behind plausible deniability. October 7th proved the Iranian regime was too reckless to be contained.
Right.
It shifted the mindset in defense departments around the world from, we need to manage this problem, to we need to permanently eliminate this capability.
And that unpredictable rogue unit chaos and willingness to burn down neighboring territories is exactly why you'd think the surrounding Arab nations would be terrified of this current airstrike. You would expect massive outrage on the Arab street over Western jets bombing a Middle Eastern country.
You would.
But looking at Dean's reporting from Dubai, the reaction on the ground is the exact opposite.
The scenes described in the source material are completely counterintuitive if you only follow surface-level news, because the former intelligence source describes widespread celebrations.
Yeah.
When the news of the Ayatollah's death broke, people were handing out sweets and playing music in the streets.
And this wasn't just happening in rival Arab nations like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. It was happening in Syria, where the Iranian regime propped up Bashar al-Assad and fueled a 14-year civil war that killed hundreds of thousands. It was happening in Yemen, a country torn apart by the Iranian-backed Houthis.
Wait, it was even happening on the streets of Iran itself. The Arab world broadly views this military strike not as an imperialist Western invasion, but as a form of chemotherapy. The region views the Iranian regime and its Revolutionary Guard Corps as a tumor that has been destroying the Middle East from the inside out for decades. The bombs are seen as a harsh, painful, but ultimately necessary treatment to save the patient.
And nowhere is that relief felt more acutely than in Riyadh. To understand the profound geopolitical panic that has gripped Saudi Arabia for the past decade, Miniter points to an extreme, often overlooked vulnerability. Saudi Arabia is 95% dependent on water desalination.
Just pause and think about that. 95%. You and I get stressed when our Wi-Fi goes down for an hour.
Right.
The Saudis have been living with the reality that they don't have vast freshwater rivers or lakes. If they can't desalinate seawater on a massive industrial scale every single day, their entire population literally cannot survive.
And decades ago, during the Iran-Iraq War, King Fahd realized how vulnerable the eastern oil facilities were to Iranian missile strikes.
Yeah.
So to protect the vital water supply, He built 17 massive desalination plants on the opposite side of the country, on the coast of the Red Sea. He thought he was securing his nation's future by putting the entire width of the Arabian Peninsula between his water and Iran's military.
But Iran played a long game. They funded and armed the Houthi militia right next door in Yemen, directly on the southern border of the Red Sea.
They flanked them.
Exactly. They flanked the Saudis. They put proxy armies right next to the very water plants that keep 38 million Saudis alive.
And over an 8-year period, the Houthis fired more than 1,000 ballistic missiles and 2,000 armed drones into Saudi Arabia. Every single one of those weapons was manufactured by or smuggled in from Iran. The Saudis have essentially been living under constant siege from an enemy armed by a state that refuses to engage in conventional state-to-state warfare.
And this is where the Force material gets heavily critical of recent U.S. foreign policy, because according to the Minuter, the Saudis felt profoundly betrayed by the Obama and Biden administrations.
Yeah, the narrative Minuter presents is that the U.S. administrations were so desperate to revive the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, that they actively pressured the Saudis to stop fighting the Houthis.
Right.
The U.S. was trying to offer concessions to bring Tehran back to the negotiating table. When the Saudis refused to halt their campaign in Yemen, arguing correctly that the Houthis were an existential threat to their maritime traffic and their border security, the U.S. took drastic measures.
Minuter claims the U.S. stopped supplying the Saudis with the Patriot missiles needed to intercept these incoming Houthi attacks. They literally halted the sale of the interceptor missiles, keeping the drones from hitting the desalination plants and cities.
And it went even further. By early 2022, the U.S. refused to update the software on the air defense systems the Saudis already had. Minuter uses the phrase sitting ducks.
Oh, wow.
They left their allies as sitting ducks. The Saudis already had the trauma of 2019 fresh in their minds, which made this policy feel like an outright abandonment.
In 2019, Iranian drones and cruise missiles struck the Saudi Aramco facilities at Abqaq and Khurais, temporarily knocking out 5.7 million barrels of oil production a day.
Half their output.
Right. That was roughly half of Saudi Arabia's total oil output, completely paralyzed in an afternoon. Feeling abandoned by Washington, feeling like the U.S. was favoring nuclear negotiations with Tehran over the physical security of a 75-year ally, the Saudis made a drastic geopolitical pivot.
Because if America wouldn't protect them, they had to protect themselves.
Okay.
So in March 2023, the Saudis went to Beijing. They allowed China to broker a non-aggression pact between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was a massive diplomatic victory for China, signaling to the world that U.S. influence in the Gulf was eroding fast.
Yeah.
The Saudis felt forced to make a deal with their primary adversary because the traditional guarantor of global security had seemingly walked off the beat.
But the geopolitical winds eventually shifted back, and Minuter pinpoints the exact turning point. It wasn't a diplomatic summit or a newly signed treaty that brought the Saudis back into the fold. It was a massive show of kinetic force last June involving B-2 bombers.
Right. The U.S. sent stealth B-2 bombers to conduct massive strikes on deeply buried Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Let's think about the signaling process there. The U.S. flew its most advanced stealth bombers halfway across the world, penetrated heavily contested airspace, and demonstrated the capability to destroy the most heavily fortified subterranean facilities on Earth. They did this purely to send a message.
And for Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, this was the exact proof he needed. It demonstrated that U.S. policy had aggressively shifted back toward forceful containment. It showed that the U.S. was finally willing to use its heaviest, most advanced weaponry to smash Iran's subterranean ambitions.
And that B-2 strike was the moment the Gulf states, Israel, and the U.S. finally realigned. The Saudis realized America was back in the game and willing to use force. It set the foundational alliance that made this current massive 2,000 sortie air campaign possible.
Everyone finally agreed that diplomatic containment had failed.
Exactly, and direct military confrontation was the only path left.
But while we focus on the military strikes and the geopolitical maneuvering, we really need to examine what is actually happening inside Iran right now. Why is the regime seemingly so fragile that a sustained air campaign could potentially topple it from within? Dean takes us deep into the economic ruin of the country to explain this fragility.
Oh, the numbers here are just absolutely staggering. We're talking about a country that has been financially bleeding out for 2 decades. The sources estimate the Iranian regime has wasted roughly $2.3 trillion over the last 20 years.
And let's break that $2.3 trillion down because it's vital context. According to the financial investigations referenced in the source, about $2 trillion of that was lost GDP. This is economic growth that simply vanished because of the crushing international sanctions placed on Iran due to its pursuit of a nuclear program.
Right.
Then, on top of that staggering loss, the regime spent an estimated $300 billion funding its proxy network arming Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and propping up Bashar al-Assad.
Just think about what an economy of 90 million people could have looked like with $2.3 trillion invested in domestic infrastructure instead of terror proxies.
Yeah.
We are talking about high-speed rail, world-class universities, a diversified tech economy, modernized water management systems. Instead, they burned through $2.3 trillion in lost wealth and proxy wars, all to protect a nuclear weapons program that only cost about $20 to $30 billion to actually build.
And Minder uses a brilliant analogy here. He compares the regime to a compulsive, drunken father in a Las Vegas casino, gambling away the entire family's life savings, mortgaging the house, and starving the kids, all based on the delusion that one day he's going to hit the nuclear jackpot and it will all be worth it.
While the regime was gambling, the Iranian people were paying the price. The sources track this through the metric of currency collapse.
This is key.
There is a direct correlation between hyperinflation and the total breakdown of civil society. They note that when the currency hits 1.3 million rials to the US dollar, you enter mass protest territory. People can no longer afford basic goods like flour and cooking oil, and they take to the streets out of sheer visceral desperation.
And the currency blew right past that threshold. The sources say the exchange rate is now sitting at an unimaginable 1.6 to 1.7 million rials to the dollar.
Wow.
At that level of hyperinflation, you are in absolute civil war territory. The economic pain is so severe that the social contract between the state and the people entirely evaporates. The people have nothing left to lose.
Yet the people cannot easily overthrow the state because the state's economy is violently monopolized by the military. And this brings us to the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We cannot think of them as just a regular standing army.
No, not at all. They have an estimated 265,000 troops, but they aren't just sitting in barracks. They operate as a massive corporate conglomerate with guns. Thanks to the way international sanctions isolated the country from foreign competition, the IRGC was able to swallow the domestic economy whole.
Dean details how they control 40 to 45% of Iran's entire economy. They have infiltrated over 100 different sectors. They control the telecommunications networks. They run the pharmaceutical and medical import businesses. They dominate construction. Most importantly, they monopolize the petrochemical and oil sectors.
If you want to build an apartment building in Tehran, you have to buy concrete from an IRGC-owned company.
Unbelievable.
If you need medicine for your sick child, you are buying it from an IRGC-controlled importer at an exorbitant markup. They have enriched themselves to an unimaginable degree, using that wealth to fund their terror networks abroad, while the average Iranian citizen literally starves in the dark due to rolling blackouts.
Which leads to the most complex and frankly the most abstract point raised by Minuter. Why does the IRGC act this way? Why are they willing to sacrifice the prosperity of 90 million Iranians and invite relentless international sanctions?
Minuter argues that to understand their motivations, you have to understand the religious fanaticism written directly into the foundational documents of the state. Most people assume the supreme leader or the president is the true head of state in Iran. But according to Article 5 of the Iranian Constitution, that is legally not true.
Wait, okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. Are we really supposed to believe that highly educated generals managing a trillion-dollar proxy empire are making tactical military decisions based on religious theology? Or is that just, state propaganda to keep the deeply religious segments of the masses in line?
It sounds like purely performative propaganda to a Western ear, right?
Totally.
But Dean and Minuter insist we cannot dismiss this as quirky religious trivia. According to their constitution, the actual head of state is the Mahdi. This is a figure in the Twelver Shia faith. The Mahdi is believed to be a 5-year-old boy who went missing down well over 1,200 years ago.
Okay.
The theological belief is that he is the ultimate savior, and the current supreme leader is merely serving as a temporary steward, holding the seat of power until the Mahdi returns.
So we are talking about a modern nation-state possessing ballistic missiles and a massive military-industrial complex whose constitution legally designates a mythical figure from a millennium ago as its ultimate supreme authority.
Yeah, and Minuter explains that this specific fanatical sect believes in eschatology, the theology of the end of the world. They genuinely believe that an apocalyptic world-ending scenario full of chaos and bloodshed is actually required to bring about the return of the Mahdi.
Wow.
This is the ideological engine of the regime's most hardcore believers, particularly within the senior ranks of the IRGC.
If that is true, it fundamentally changes how we must view their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Think about the Cold War. The entire concept of nuclear deterrence was based on M&D, mutually assured destruction.
Right.
The US and the Soviets didn't launch their nukes because both sides wanted to live. The threat of total annihilation kept everyone rational.
How do you deter an enemy that actively wants the world to end?
You can't.
Exactly. Ministers argues the core leadership of the IRGC is not acting rationally in the Western sense of the word. They are acting on divine prophecy. If you give atomic bombs to people who believe a fiery apocalypse will summon their messiah, the standard rules of geopolitical deterrence completely disintegrate. They don't view mutually assured destruction as a threat. They view it as a theological goal.
We have a regime sitting on a collapsed economy, controlled by a mafia-like military guard, driven by an apocalyptic prophecy, and now thousands of bombs are raining down on their heads. The bombs are falling, but what happens when the dust clears?
That's the big question, because the sources reveal a massive divergence among the allies conducting this strike. They may be dropping bombs together, but they have completely different competing visions for what the end state of Iran should look like once the military capability is degraded.
Let's look at Vision 1, Israel's dream. The Israelis want total regime change. They want to completely uproot the Islamic Republic. Specifically, the sources say Israel is heavily pushing the idea of installing Reza Pahlavi, the son of the ousted Shah, as a constitutional monarch.
The Israeli vision is an Iran focused entirely inward. They want a moderate, Western-leaning leader who will immediately stop funding proxy wars and start focusing on Iran's profound internal crises.
Right.
Iran is facing massive ecological disasters, severe water shortages, and 70% of its provinces lack 24-hour electricity. Israel wants a neighbor busy fixing its own plumbing and electrical grids, not building rockets in caves.
Moving to Vision 2, we have America's plan. And this is where Minitor drops a massive revelation regarding the intelligence community. The CIA does not want total regime change. In fact, the CIA has handed Israel a secret no-kill list containing the names of 5 to 10 top Iranian leaders who are strictly off-limits during this bombing campaign.
That detail is stunning because it indicates the U.S. intelligence community believes total regime change is simply too unpredictable. If you completely shatter the power structure of a nation of 90 million people, a nation deeply divided by ethnic groups like the Kurds, Azeris, and Balokis, you risk unleashing a chaotic multi-decade civil war. The U.S. prefers pruning the regime rather than uprooting it entirely.
The idea is to assassinate the absolute worst hardliners, let the regime absorb the shock, and allow a pragmatic survivor, someone like the wily politician Ali Larijani, to take the reins. The U.S. wants to rebuild Iran in America's interest, not in America's image.
Right, because building a country in America's image means trying to force a Western-style democracy with by-elections, a Supreme Court, and a free press, a strategy that failed spectacularly and tragically in Iraq and Afghanistan. Building a country in America's interest is much simpler and more cynical.
Yeah.
It just means an Iran that is contained, an Iran that is not launching terror attacks against its neighbors, and an Iran with this stabilized, dollarized currency so it can integrate into global markets.
Minitor quotes a former U.S. defense official who said the realistic goal for a stabilized Middle Eastern nation isn't a carbon copy of Washington, D.C., it's Romania 1995.
That's a great comparison.
Think about Romania in 1995. Recovering from communism, highly corrupt, a bit messy internally, but fundamentally contained and not invading its neighbors. That's the pragmatic CIA off-ramp.
Then we have Vision 3, the Gulf states' nightmare. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are terrified of what happens if the U.S. and Israeli plans fail and the central government collapses entirely. The Gulf states desperately want Iran to remain united as a single nation-state, even if it's an adversary.
If Iran descends into a fragmented civil war, the fallout for the region will be catastrophic. Arab diplomats told Dean they are terrified of millions of desperate refugees pouring across the Persian Gulf in boats, fleeing sectarian violence. They look at what happened in Syria, a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, and they realize a civil war in a country of 90 million people would be a Syria 10 times over.
Right.
It would destabilize the entire hemisphere.
And navigating these competing visions, Israel wanting a new monarchy, the U.S. wanting a pruned regime, and the Gulf states just wanting the borders to hold together falls on the current U.S. administration, which brings us to the intense domestic and geopolitical calculations driving this entire war.
When we look through ministers' breakdown of Trump's gamble, the domestic reality is stark. The administration is operating on a very tight political clock. Midterm elections are always looming in the background of these decisions.
Yeah.
The Republicans hold a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives.
The domestic calculus is ruthless. If this war drags on, if it turns into a messy, prolonged quagmire with rising gas prices and horrific images on the nightly news, the administration could easily lose control of the House in the midterms. If that happens, the rest of the presidential term will be paralyzed by endless congressional investigations into the war's execution. The administration desperately needs a fast, clean foreign policy victory.
They ideally want this military phase wrapped up in 4 weeks. But that timeline is incredibly fragile, especially when you factor in the deep emotional scars the American public still carries regarding Iran. Mineter brings up the historical trauma and the echoes of 1979.
The 1979 hostage crisis is foundational to understanding U.S.-Iran relations. 52 American diplomats were held captive in Tehran for 444 days. For any American over the age of 45, those two numbers are burned into their memory. They remember watching the nightly news, seeing blindfolded Americans being paraded around by the Revolutionary Guard.
Mineter describes it as a Roman sense of American honor that demands satisfaction. Because of that historical trauma, there is virtually zero sympathy for the Iranian regime among older American voters. But there is a massive wild card that could destroy any chance of a quick 4-week CIA off-ramp.
The sources cite FBI estimates that there are roughly 700 Hezbollah terrorist sleeper cells currently operating inside the United States. We are already seeing the precursors to domestic violence. The sources reference recent, highly concerning attacks in Austin, Texas and Washington, D.C., involving individuals expressing radicalized Iranian-aligned sentiments.
If those Hezbollah sleeper cells are activated, if we start seeing coordinated bombings or attacks on American soil, the political calculus changes overnight. The American public will not tolerate domestic terror. If blood is spilled in American cities, the public will demand the total, absolute eradication of the IRGC.
If domestic attacks happen, the CIA's secret no-kill list goes out the window immediately. The pragmatic plan to install a moderate leader evaporates. The administration will be forced by immense public pressure into a full-scale regime change war, regardless of the chaotic consequences for the Middle East. It is an enormous gamble.
It's a gamble being played on a much larger board than just the Middle East, too. This is where the deep dive zooms all the way out. Because looking at the global chessboard, this isn't just about Iran. Mineter frames this entire operation as a massive proxy war against Russia and China.
He describes this as a Kissingerian masterstroke, a deeply complex, multi-layered geopolitical chess move designed by a very small group of strategists. You have to spread out the world map to see the pattern.
Think about the supply chain connections. By taking out Iran's military infrastructure, you destroy the factories producing the Shahed suicide drones being shipped to Russia. Suddenly, the Russian military is starved of the cheap, effective weapons they rely on to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses.
Right.
You cripple Putin's war machine without firing a single bullet in Eastern Europe.
And looking east toward China, the economic connections are just as profound. China's economy is heavily reliant on importing cheap, heavily sanctioned oil from Iran. If the Iranian regime falls, or if its oil infrastructure is systematically taken offline by allied bombers, that pipeline of cheap energy to Beijing is severed.
Dean adds an incredible detail here about India's quiet involvement. We are seeing a coordinated recalibration of global power on the high seas. The Indian Navy is actively boarding and in some cases sinking. The shadow fleets of Russian and Iranian oil tankers trying to bypass international sanctions.
When you cut off China's access to that cheap black market oil, their energy costs skyrocket and their economy slows down. A slowed-down Chinese economy is one much less capable of financing a military buildup to menace Taiwan or project power in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
The strategy here is profound. By dismantling the primary disruptor in the Middle East, the West is simultaneously financially and militarily starving both Russia and China.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the sheer magnitude of 2,000 bombing sorties lighting up the Middle Eastern sky. We uncovered a story about a missing 1,200-year-old boy supposedly dictating nuclear policy, a collapsed economy burning through $2.3 trillion to fund terror proxies, secret CIA no-kill lists, and a grand master plan to starve the war machines of Russia and China.
It validates the absolute necessity of looking past surface-level news alerts. Everything is intricately connected. The price of your gasoline, a suicide drone flying over a battlefield in Ukraine, the religious eschatology of a supreme leader, and a bunker-busting bomb penetrating a mountain. They are all threads in the exact same geopolitical tapestry. You cannot understand one without understanding them all.
That is exactly why we do these deep dives, taking these complex sources and extracting the signal from the noise. But before we let you go, we want to leave you with something to consider as this event continues to unfold.
The sources laid out a brilliant, almost elegant strategy where the West uses the fall of Iran to financially and militarily starve Russia and China. It sounds like a geopolitical checkmate. But consider this. If you intentionally corner two nuclear-armed superpowers by dismantling their primary Middle Eastern disruptor, how will they react? They aren't going to just sit quietly in the dark and accept defeat. If Iran falls and the chessboard is permanently flipped, where on the global map do Russia and China light the next fire?
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep your eyes on the map.